Some breaking news just in. The BBC chairman, Samir Shah, has said the corporation has received a letter from President Trump. The chair says they're now considering how to reply to him.
Asked if Mr Trump has said that he will be suing the BBC, Mr Shah said, "I do not know that yet, but he's a litigious fellow, so we should be prepared for all outcomes."
Just to repeat that breaking news, the BBC has now been in receipt of a letter from President Trump. They haven't yet, though, divulged whether or not Mr Trump is going to sue them.
So we shall keep close to you on that breaking news. But let's now cross line to GB News' national reporter, Will Godley, who joins us live from Broadcasting House. So, Will, we have now got the news that Donald Trump has written to the BBC and warned them that something is coming, but we don't know what yet. Will?
No news yet what that might be. These revelations came amid the BBC chair sitting down with BBC News in the building behind me earlier on, and they are now publishing lines that they're getting from that interview. Of course, after he gave that written letter and apology to MPs who asked for that from the Select Committee, the Media, Culture and Sports Select Committee, about how exactly this could possibly happen in the first place. This was, of course, a documentary that aired over a year ago now, BBC Panorama, the BBC's flagship current affairs programme, in which now the BBC are admitting that the way they edited Donald Trump's speech gave the impression that he made a direct call for violent action. Well, that is what they have apologised for today, apologising for, in their words, an error of judgment. Since this reporting came about last week in the Daily Telegraph, the BBC have said they have received 500 complaints about this editing, and that is what's prompted further reflection from the BBC. Of course, two very high-profile resignations yesterday. The Director General, Tim Davie, and their CEO of News, Deborah Turness, when she was entering New Broadcasting House behind us earlier on today. She accepted that mistakes were made, but told reporters that there was no institutional bias at the BBC, and that is something echoed in the chair's letter to MPs today. They said that they take Mr Prescott's concerns seriously, but that they said the fact that BBC, as he alleges, sought to bury stories is simply untrue. And in order to tackle some of what he has come forward with, these allegations of systemic bias at the BBC, they've said they are going to immediately appoint a new director of documentary and long form who would oversee BBC Panorama and other documentaries and pieces of journalism at the BBC to avoid these kinds of mistakes, as the BBC are calling it, from happening in the future. Mr Prescott also alleges that systemic bias in BBC Arabic's coverage of the war in Gaza, and they have said in this apology that they have recently appointed a new Arabic-speaking head of editorial who will oversee that channel to avoid any problems arising in the future. But all of this comes amid the BBC entering into talks to renew their charter. That is what keeps them going and how they get their funding. And this charter that they currently have runs out in 2027. So it's very, very important for the BBC to enter into conversations amid an atmosphere with the public trust at a high point. But all of these scandals and this latest scandal, which has led to two resignations, no doubt leading public trust in the BBC and BBC News to fall even lower.
Well, Will Godley, thanks indeed for braving the storm there, both literally and figuratively, outside New Broadcasting House. We'll be back with you a little bit later in the programme.
All right, well, joining us now is a former BBC journalist, Danny Shaw. Danny, thank you for joining the programme. Are you surprised at what has sort of transpired at the BBC? Because when you were there, did you feel a sense of a one-sided culture?
I worked at the BBC for 31 years, and I do think that it suffers, as many organisations do, from a groupthink at times when there are too many people in the same room who read the same newspapers and come from the same areas, whether it's too much of a sort of metropolitan view of things, or whether it's a kind of left or soft left view of things. Of course, there are people there who represent different political parties, or who have sort of gone on to represent other political parties and work for other political parties on the right. That's absolutely true. But in general, I think it suffers from a groupthink, and I think that's very dangerous for a newsroom, any newsroom, whether it's GB News, Sky News, ITV News, or BBC News, to have that. You need people in the room who have different views, and this should be a warning to everyone, who have different views, who come from different angles, who have different backgrounds and different take on the story. And I think that sometimes in the BBC that didn't happen. And I think what has happened here, I think the other thing that was that my impression is the BBC is very defensive at times. And when a mistake is made and it's challenged about it, its sort of default reaction is to sort of put up the shutters and say, oh, we haven't got anything wrong, we've done nothing wrong here. That's one thing it does. The other thing it does is sort of put it into the long grass, bat it off to someone else to deal with, and someone else to deal with, and hopefully it's sort of everything will die down and it goes away. And so what we're seeing here is actually, in my view, the culmination of two things. One, a sort of groupthink mentality, which has, I think, influenced some of its coverage. And secondly, not dealing with complaints robustly enough when they first come out. I mean, this Trump program went out, I think, last year, and there was a report about it, I think, 6 months ago. Why wasn't it dealt with? I mean, it's a fairly obvious mistake to me. It was internally edited, that clip, to give a different meaning to the speech. And that's basic. That is very basic in broadcast journalism. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to tell you that they made a mistake there. There may be reasons for it, and there may be mitigation, but they should have admitted that really early on, and now they're facing all sorts of consequences because of it.
I mean, it seems like we've been on this carousel, this merry-go-round, for a very, very long time. I remember the arguments and the debates in the wake of the referendum in 2016, and a lot of media said, look, OK, we were out of step with the country, we've got to get out there into the real country, you need to step outside of SW1 or W1A or whatever it is, and we need to sort of check ourselves and step out of the bubble that we live in. And then again, we had that in 2019, and it seems like we're having that conversation again now. I wonder if the fundamentals are just so difficult to adjust, given the people that come out of universities and want jobs in the media. I mean, very few of those people have the same worldview as perhaps even the majority of the country. I mean, is this just an impossible task to complete for an organisation that isn't ideological in its very charter, but ideological people apply to work there by just the nature of the market?
I think it's a very good question. And look, I do think you need to be realistic. The BBC produces thousands of programmes on radio, television, and articles online and on social media every single day. There are so many outlets. Of course, there are going to be mistakes. Of course, there are going to be misjudgments, as there are on any news channel. That's inevitable, particularly when you do a lot of live programming. But I think you're right about the background. The media, the creative arts, journalism tends to attract people from a certain background who perhaps have a certain worldview. Not everyone, but it does tend to lean in that direction, which is why it's so important that as the leadership, you need to ensure that you are trying to reflect a diverse view and that you get out the office. I mean, I was guilty of it as a Home Affairs correspondent at the BBC, reporting on immigration in the 2000s. And then, in the lead up to the Brexit referendum, when immigration was obviously a key topic. And I was guilty, as were others, of probably not getting out of the office enough and not talking to people and understanding people's concerns about the changing character and nature of their communities. And there weren't enough people in the room who probably said, you know, you need to get out and understand what people are doing. And so it's about management and leadership to do that. And the other thing is you leave your political affiliations at the door. I think there is a lot of younger people at the BBC coming in with, and perhaps that isn't drummed into them enough. This is not a campaigning organisation. You do not campaign on issues at the BBC. You report them impartially. You can bring your experiences to bear in terms of journalism, but what you don't do is you leave your politics behind and you leave your campaigning behind.
All right, Danny Shaw, thank you very much. I think perhaps, are we asking too much of the BBC to be able to be impartial? Because as Danny said, there are so many facets to the BBC. But one thing I would say, though, is Panorama is their flagship documentary arm, one of the biggest shows that's been going on for years and years. If you see it on Panorama, you believe it and you trust it. So you would just think that on something like this, and when you're dealing with somebody who is the leader of the free world, or you just wouldn't mislead, you just wouldn't mess up.
And yet they did. And yet they have.
Would you? I mean, you've literally changed the meaning of something that he has said.
And now President Trump has written to the BBC. Yeah. We understand this letter threatens legal action. Let's speak to our political correspondent, Olivia Utley, about this, because there isn't really an equivalent of the BBC in the United States. I mean, I suppose it's inexorably tied up with the British state. I mean, this is really troubling for not just the BBC as a corporation, but actually Britain as a country. If this flagship element with Britain in the name has attracted the ire of the world's most powerful man.
Well, absolutely. And I'm fascinated in what Keir Starmer makes of all of this. He has spent a lot of the past year trying to cozy up to President Trump, trying to get various deals between the UK and the US. We saw that a state visit from President Trump recently where Keir Starmer was sort of touching his shoulder, bending down to pick up some papers that Donald Trump has dropped. He is desperate to get in Donald Trump's good books. And contrary to what many people thought, obviously, these two men are very, very different animals. The President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom have formed what seems to be quite a close bond. But that bond could be under threat. Donald Trump has been very, very critical in what he's said about the BBC. And as you say, Tom, the BBC is sort of inexorably linked with Britain as a whole. Now, of course, Keir Starmer doesn't have any say on who becomes the next Director General. That is a matter for the board. And although the BBC is funded by the taxpayer, it is independent from the government. But to an American audience, to perhaps Donald Trump and definitely to a lot of his followers, that distinction will be semantics. They will think the British state broadcaster, they will understandably think, is connected to the British state. So what if there is some kind of implication? What if American voters, even if the president himself understands that this isn't true, they may believe that Keir Starmer somehow sanctioned this editorial mistake, as the BBC are calling it, which changed the meaning of what Donald Trump said. And if that is the case, there could be serious ramifications on that special relationship between the UK and the US. So what Tim Davies seemed to have originally at least put down to just being a sort of minor problem in an editorial suite, some sort of junior employee accidentally splicing together these two different speeches, presenting them as one without making it clear that they had edited it, that has turned into what could be quite a serious diplomatic incident, especially if Donald Trump goes ahead and does what he says and attempts to perhaps sue the BBC.
I know that he is aware, though, and his administration are aware that it is publicly funded. I suspect he probably feels quite sorry for the British public because obviously we've had to put up with the BBC. But I'm wondering, what do you think now in terms of what our political class will be doing? Because, of course, Keir Starmer, he's away. He hasn't said anything at all yet, has he?
No, Number 10 is saying that they do not believe that the BBC is institutionally corrupt. They don't believe that it's institutionally biased, and they have made clear that they are supportive of the BBC's aims. They have praised the BBC, and they have said that it is a good thing that they have now apologised. That is the official statement from Number 10. Obviously, Nigel Farage, who lots of people in this country are now seeing as the opposition almost, even though, of course, the Conservatives are the official opposition in the UK. Nigel Farage has so much momentum behind him, he almost holds a figurative opposition seat. He has gone much further, and in a press conference this morning, he said that the BBC has been institutionally biased for decades. He said that it is wholly unsustainable in its current form. And when I asked him who the next Director General of the BBC should be, this is what he had to say.
I did notice that Donald Trump's press secretary, Catherine Leavitt, suggested British viewers watch GB News, not the BBC, which was quite interesting last night. Look, I don't know who comes in from outside, but it's got to be somebody from the outside. As I said, I think it's somebody from the private sector. It's somebody that's gone into a failing organisation and has turned around not just the profitability of the organisation, but turned around the culture of the organisation. And my worry, Olivia, with the BBC is it employs its people from such a narrow segment of society that I don't think they think they're biased at all.
So Nigel Farage obviously not pulling his punches there. I think whoever is Prime Minister at the next election, whether it's Keir Starmer or Nigel Farage, there will be very serious questions about that BBC Charter, about how the BBC is funded in the future. That decision is due to be made at the end of 2027. And there are plenty of politicians, definitely from Reform, lots of Conservatives too, but even some in the Labour Party who believe that the current licence fee model is outdated and needs to be reformed. And I think this crisis, the Director General and the Head of News resigning at the same time, completely unprecedented crisis, has come at a very, very bad moment for the BBC if they're hoping to keep the licence fee.
This is one of the really big issues here, because these are two distinct issues. The licence fee, charter renewal, all the rest of it. It's a structural, how the BBC is funded, how it runs in the 21st century. And yet this separate issue of bias and clear editorial standard slippage and all the rest of it, and yet these two things become conflated and one almost flows into the next.
Well, absolutely. And I think why is because if the BBC is to be funded by the taxpayer, by the licence fee, then it has to be doing something which no other TV channel, no other TV news channel could do. And perhaps there is a niche for the BBC, for a state-funded channel, for a taxpayer-funded channel, if it is able to give completely impartial news, if it isn't beholden to anyone higher up, if it is simply an instrument of the state to get across impartial news. If it begins to fail to do that, if those editorial standards start slipping and bias starts creeping in, then there is a question mark over what the BBC is for in this day and age. As I think you mentioned earlier, Tom, the BBC has been around since almost the dawn of British television. And at that time, that was sort of the only way that people got their news. Now there are such a plethora of ways to get news. If the BBC wants to make itself different, then it has to be doing something completely different from all the other channels. Something so completely unbiased, washing its hands of all kinds of politics. And if it can't do that, then where is the future for it? And that's the question that politicians are asking at the moment.